My child has a 99.997% recovery rate from COVID. I will not subject them to an injection still undergoing clinical trials.
As a father of four, I stand here today to say I don't consent, and I will never consent to any COVID injection of my children.
I will never inject my child with an experimental COVID injection.
I do not consent, and I will never consent to my children being part of the biggest human experiment of all time.
I do not consent.
I will never inject my children with the experimental COVID vaccine. I do not consent.
I will never inject my children with an experimental COVID jab. I do not consent.
I do not and will not ever consent to them having an experimental COVID jab. I will not have them used as sacrificial lambs for this so-called herd immunity.
I refuse to sacrifice my children for the herd. I do not consent.
I will never inject my kids with an experimental COVID-19 vaccination. I do not consent.
I do not consent.
I do not consent.
We do not consent.
I do not consent. Ever.
I do not consent.
We do not consent.
I do not consent.
I will never inject my child with the experimental COVID injection.
I do not consent for my children to ever receive the COVID injection.
I do not consent to my child being vaccinated by the experimental COVID vaccine. My child has his own natural immune system that will keep him safe. I do not consent. I do not consent. I do not consent.
I will never inject my children with the experimental COVID injection. I do not consent.
My child has a 99.997% recovery rate from COVID. I will not subject them to an injection currently still in clinical trials.
I will never subject my child to the experimental COVID injection.
I will never, ever inject my child with an experimental COVID-19 injection.